Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. You know how we do it here. Taking a topic that's got everyone buzzing and really getting into the weeds.
Mm.
This time, it's all about DOGE.
DOGE.
Yeah,
You're going to be hearing that name a lot. It stands for Department of Government Efficiency.
right. And it's President-elect Trump's big plan to, totally shake up how the government works.
Exactly. We're talking about potential major budget cuts, streamlining the whole federal machine, the works. And we've got this in-depth legal analysis to help us unpack it all.
So, less government,
Mm-hmm.
more efficiency.
Mm.
That's the idea in a nutshell.
Mm.
But how is DOGE actually supposed to work? I mean, the structure of it alone is raising a lot of eyebrows.
It's true. Right off the bat, there's this big question mark hanging over DOGE's structure. Nobody seems to know exactly what it's going to look like, which is kind of wild because that has huge implications for how much power it'll actually have.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are the different ways DOGE could be set up?
Well, the first possibility is that it operates as a federal advisory committee, FA.
AFAC.
Which means it would have to play by the rules laid out in FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act.
Ah, more acronyms.
Right. Well, FACA basically says that these committees have to be really transparent about how they operate. Disclose any conflicts of interest, hold public meetings, that sort of thing.
So option one is playing by the book, lots of rules and oversight. What's the other option?
The alternative is that DOGE functions as an independent NGO, a non-governmental organization.
Okay, so more like a think tank.
Kind of. But with a
Yeah.
serious megaphone.
What?
I mean, look who's involved.
Oh.
Wouldn't be just any think tank.
True, but wouldn't that limit their power? I mean, if
Like-
they're just making suggestions.
Yeah, it's a trade-off. An NGO would have a lot more freedom to operate, but it wouldn't have any real legal authority to enforce its recommendations. It'd be more about persuasion and influence.
So option one, the FAC gets more official clout, but has to follow the rules. Option two, the NGO is more agile, but might lack teeth. What do you think Trump's strategy is here? Why would he prefer one over the other?
That's the million-dollar question. I think an FAC brings legitimacy. A clearer path to actually influencing policy. But it comes with those strings attached, the NGO route. Well, it's riskier. But it could allow them to sidestep some potential legal headaches.
And to make things even more complicated, there's this whole debate about whether FACA, that law about advisory committees, is even constitutional.
Oh, yeah. Some legal scholars are saying the president has the right to seek advice from whoever he wants, regardless of what FACA says. So if that argument gains traction, we could be looking at a major constitutional showdown.
Oh, yeah. Adding fuel to the fire.
Uh.
Okay, so we've got this uncertain structure, potential legal battles. But one thing's for sure, DOGE has put together a serious A-team. Let's talk about the brains behind this whole thing.
It is quite a lineup. You've got
Sure.
Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy right at the helm. I mean, that alone gets your attention.
Two pretty big names in their own right.
And then you've got William McGinley, who was Trump's cabinet secretary in his first term. He's acting as counsel to DOGE.
So they've got experience, political savvy. And I've heard the application process to join this elite group was pretty unconventional.
Understatement. Apparently, the only way to apply was to DM Elon Musk on X.
What? Seriously? Yeah. Not your typical job application.
So who actually made it through that DM filter? Give us the highlights of this all-star roster.
Well, we're talking about some heavy hitters in business and tech. There's Bill Ackman, Mark Andreessen, even Travis Kalanick, the former CEO of Uber, is in the mix.
Wow, that's a pretty impressive squad. But with big names, often come big potential conflicts of interest. Is that a concern here?
Yeah. It's something to watch closely.
Yeah.
Some of these advisors, their companies have existing government contracts. So you have to wonder if DOGE's recommendations end up lining up with their business interests. Is that a coincidence or something else going on?
Right. The optics aren't great. Okay, so let's move on to DOGE's actual goals. What are they planning to do, and how realistic are their plans? Well, they're aiming for a complete overhaul of the federal government. They're focusing on three main things: slashing the deficit, shrinking the federal workforce, and reining in what they call the administrative state.
Ambitious, to say the least. Let's break those down. Starting with the deficit, how much are they talking about cutting? Give us some numbers.
Musk has floated the idea of a $2 trillion reduction.
$2 trillion. That's like more than the entire discretionary budget for 2024.
It's a massive cut, no doubt about it.
So where are they going to find these savings?
Well, they've identified a whole range of potential targets. Some are really specific, others are more broad. For example, they're talking about cutting funding for NGOs' DEI programs, public broadcasting like PBS and NPR, even Planned Parenthood.
Okay, so right away, we're seeing some pretty controversial choices.
Absolutely. And it gets even more interesting. Elon Musk wants to completely eliminate tax credits for electric vehicles.
Even though that would directly impact his own company, Tesla?
Exactly. He says he's committed to the principle, no matter the personal cost.
Wow, that's a bold move. What about Ramaswamy? Any specific areas he's looking at?
He's made it clear that DOGE will be taking a hard look at contracts awarded under the CHIPS Acts, especially those that were fast-tracked by the Biden administration.
So potential shakeups in the tech industry as well. But hold on. Can a president just decide not to spend money that Congress has already allocated?
That's where things get tricky legally. There's a law called the Impoundment Control Act, which basically says the president needs congressional approval for any significant cuts.
But didn't Trump challenge that law during his first term?
He did. He's repeatedly said that he thinks the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. He argues that the president has the ultimate authority over how money is spent, even if Congress has already earmarked it. So yeah, we could be in for another major showdown between the executive and legislative branches.
It never ends.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the deficit reduction plan, or at least the broad strokes. What about shrinking the federal workforce? How are they planning to do that?
It seems like they're going for a mix of incentives and, well, maybe some less appealing options. They're talking about ending remote work for federal employees, relocating agencies away from D.C., offering early retirement incentives and severance packages.
So trying to encourage people to leave on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
But what if those incentives don't work?
They haven't ruled out large-scale layoffs. And there's even talk of Trump trying to convert many civil service jobs into political appointments.
Wow, that would be a huge power shift. Okay, and last but not least, this taming the administrative state idea. It all seems a bit abstract and maybe the most radical part of their agenda.
It's definitely their most ambitious goal, basically. They want to dramatically reduce the power and scope of federal agencies. They're talking about potentially eliminating or consolidating as much as 75% of existing agencies.
75%. That's a huge chunk of the government. How do they think they can actually pull that off?
Their strategy seems to be based on a few recent Supreme Court decisions, particularly the case of West Virginia v. EPA. This case established what's called the Major Questions Doctrine.
Okay, back up. What's the Major Questions Doctrine?
It basically says that federal agencies can't make big policy decisions without clear authorization from Congress.
So DOGE is using this legal precedent to try to dismantle the current regulatory system.
Exactly. They're arguing that a lot of existing regulations go way beyond what Congress actually authorized agencies to do. And they think these court decisions give them the ammunition to challenge those regulations.
Interesting. So even long-standing regulations could be vulnerable.
Potentially, which could have huge implications for certain industries.
And which agencies are they specifically targeting?
They've mentioned going after the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Department of Education, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, even the Department of Justice.
Wow, so a pretty broad attack on agencies that touch a lot of aspects of our lives. But can they really just ignore regulations they don't like? What's stopping these agencies from pushing back?
That's a great question. And that's where things could get really interesting. You're going to have resistance from the agencies themselves, from career civil servants, and probably from the courts, too. We could see some major legal battles over this.
Sounds like a recipe for chaos. Okay, so DOGE has this incredibly ambitious vision: cut the deficit, shrink the government, roll back regulations. But do they actually have the support to pull any of this off?
You might be surprised. They've actually attracted some bipartisan interest in Congress.
Really? I thought this was purely a Trump Republican initiative.
There's definitely strong support from the right. The House Oversight Committee is even setting up a special DOGE subcommittee chaired by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. And there's a new DOGE caucus forming in both the House and the Senate, attracting members like Representatives Aaron Bean and Pete Sessions and Senator Joni Ernst.
So they've got the machinery in place to push their agenda forward. But what about Democrats? Any interest from their side?
Believe it or not, yes, Florida Congressman Jared Moskowitz has joined the House DOGE caucus. And there are rumors that other Democrats might follow suit.
Wow, that's a surprise. What's attracting them to this initiative? It seems like a pretty hard sell for Democrats.
It seems like the common ground is this shared concern about government waste and inefficiency. Even Senator Bernie Sanders, while not officially part of the caucus, has expressed interest in working with DOGE to target wasteful spending within the Department of Defense.
So some unusual alliances forming over this. It seems like DOGE has tapped into a sentiment that goes beyond party lines.
Absolutely. And they're not just relying on the traditional channels to get their message out. They're using a very modern tech-savvy approach, leveraging Elon Musk's massive following on X.
Makes sense. Why bother with press releases and formal statements when you can just tweet directly to millions of people?
Right. And they're even encouraging people to tweet their own suggestions for cuts, basically crowdsourcing their agenda. And then there's this upcoming DOGEcast.
DOGEcast, what's that?
It's going to be a podcast hosted by Musk and Ramaswamy themselves. They're billing it as a direct line to the public.
A podcast straight from the cost cutters themselves. Talk about transparency. Or at least a very clever PR move.
It's definitely a very unconventional approach to government communication. We'll have to see how effective it is.
Well, one thing's for sure, DOGE is audacious, potentially game-changing, and definitely shrouded in a bit of mystery. It's the kind of thing that makes for a perfect deep dive.
And what's especially fascinating is what this all might mean for the future. Even if DOGE only achieves a fraction of its goals, the implications could be significant for you and your work in. Well, let's think about it. If DOGE manages to significantly reduce the size and scope of the federal government, it could mean less regulation, fewer agencies to deal with, potentially a more business-friendly environment. That could have a real impact on your day-to-day work.
So less red tape, fewer bureaucratic hurdles, more freedom to innovate. That sounds promising, but I'm always a bit wary of unintended consequences. What's the potential downside here?
That's a smart question to ask. You're right. There could be some trade-offs. It could mean less government support for certain industries, changes in funding for research and development, a shift in the overall economic landscape. It really depends on which specific policies DOGE actually ends up prioritizing and how effectively they manage to implement them.
Yeah. It's like we're looking at this giant puzzle, and we only have a few pieces right now. But that's why I think these deep dives are so valuable. They help us make sense of these complex issues and prepare for what might be coming.
Exactly. And that's why we always encourage you to stay engaged. Keep asking questions and form your own opinions. Don't just take our word for it. Dig deeper. See what resonates with you.
Speaking of digging deeper, I'm really curious about this DOGEcast podcast. Have they released any details about what they plan to discuss? It sounds like a pretty direct line to Musk and Ramaswamy, which is both exciting and a little intimidating.
They haven't revealed specifics yet, but based on what Ramaswamy has said, it seems like they'll be using it to provide updates on their progress, explain their policy goals in more detail, and potentially even respond to questions and feedback from listeners.
So it could be a platform for them to control the narrative, but also a way to gauge public sentiment and maybe even adjust their course if things aren't landing well.
Exactly. It's a fascinating experiment in government transparency and public engagement, all playing out online, which is, well, it's the internet, a bit of a Wild West.
Definitely. We'll be tuning in, and we'll keep you updated on anything interesting we hear on DOGEcast. But for now, let's wrap up our deep dive into this legal analysis of DOGE. What are the key takeaways we want you to remember?
Well, first and foremost, DOGE is still a bit of a mystery. We don't know for sure how it will be structured, but the two most likely options are a federal advisory committee or an independent NGO.
And that choice will determine how much power DOGE really has, how transparent they have to be, and who will be holding them accountable.
Right. If they go the FAC route, they'll be subject to more rules and scrutiny. But they'll also have more direct access to the levels of government. If they choose the NGO route, they'll have more flexibility, less oversight, but their influence will depend on their ability to persuade, not command.
And then there's that whole question about whether FACA, the law that governs advisory committees, is even constitutional. That could lead to some pretty interesting legal challenges.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on. And then, of course, we have DOGE's incredibly ambitious agenda, those massive cuts to the deficit, the plan to shrink the federal workforce, and this fundamental reshaping of the administrative state through deregulation.
It's a truly audacious plan. I mean, they're talking about dismantling huge parts of the federal government as we know it.
And they're facing some serious obstacles. Congress might not be on board with such drastic cuts, and legally, the president's power to just withhold funds is limited. Plus, we can expect pushback from the agencies themselves, career civil servants, and probably the courts, too.
That's going to be a battle, that's for sure. A lot of powerful interests at play.
But DOGE does have some advantages. They've managed to attract bipartisan support in Congress, which is pretty impressive. And they're using some unconventional tactics like crowdsourcing and podcasts to engage the public and build momentum.
It's a bold approach, unorthodox. And it's impossible to predict how it will all play out. But one thing's for sure, this whole DOGE saga is going to be a wild ride.
And we'll be here to help you make sense of it. Stay tuned for more deep dives as this story unfolds.
All right, that wraps up part 2 of our DOGE deep dive. Join us for the final part, where we'll explore some of the potential long-term impacts of this whole initiative.
And we're back, wrapping up our deep dive into DOGE, this ambitious plan to really shake up the federal government.
And before we go, I think it's important to think about the potential long-term impact of this whole thing.
Okay.
Even if DOGE only manages to achieve a small part of what it sets out to do.
Right, even small changes at the federal level can have pretty big ripple effects, way beyond Washington, D.C. Exactly. So let's say DOGE's efforts to shrink the federal workforce actually lead to a lot of layoffs or relocations. How could that affect local economies in cities that really depend on government jobs?
It could be like a reverse brain drain. People are suddenly forced to move to find new opportunities. And it's not just jobs either. Think about the impact on housing schools, local businesses. A whole community could be turned upside down.
And what if DOGE actually succeeds in this deregulation push, rolling back all these rules in industries like finance, energy, tech? On the one hand, it could lead to a real boost in certain sectors, maybe create new jobs, boost economic growth. But are we ready for the potential risks? The unintended consequences?
It's that whole be careful what you wish for thing, right? We might get less regulation, but are we sacrificing security and stability for some short-term gains?
That's a good question. And we can't forget about the impact on innovation either. What happens if DOGE cuts funding for research and development or eliminates agencies like the National Science Foundation?
I mean, government funding has been so crucial to some amazing innovations. The internet, GPS, medical breakthroughs. Cutting that funding could really stifle progress.
It could. And then you've got AI and automation.
Yeah.
What if DOGE's push to streamline government services leads to more reliance on these technologies?
Could go either way, I guess. It could make things more efficient, more user-friendly, or it could create new problems, accessibility bias, even job displacement.
Right. It's a two-sided coin, like so many of these changes. Greater efficiency might come at the expense of human connection. Accountability. It really makes you think about the trade-offs anytime you're trying to change something as complex as the federal government.
For sure. And it shows how interconnected everything is. One change in one area can have big consequences in others, often in ways that are hard to predict.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to be informed, to think critically, to engage in these conversations. What's happening now is shaping the future.
Yeah.
And we all have a part in deciding what that future will look like.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. DOGE is a bold experiment. No doubt about it. And the consequences could be huge. We've given you the information, but now it's up to you to stay curious, stay engaged, form your own opinions.
And remember, we'll be back to help you make sense of it all as this story continues to unfold, so stay tuned for more deep dives into the topics that matter. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.